Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my Booktube prize reading. I was reading in the nonfiction category, specifically in Group C, and amazingly, as soon as it was announced, I was able to get 2 of the books out of the library right away. A couple more I got within a week, so that's been pretty successful so far. I'm going to have to film this in a couple of chunks. I'm going to start out having read 4 out of the 6. The first book that I read was Sonia Faleiro's The Good Girls, An Ordinary Killing. This is a piece of investigative journalism that looks into that very famous case in 2014 where 2 girls in this poor village in northern India were found hanging in a tree. And because somebody took a picture and posted it to Twitter, it became internationally known and led to a lot of controversy. It was initially in the news that they had been raped and murdered. It then turned out that it was probably a double suicide, and then there were rumors that maybe it could have been an honor killing, and also the investigation went very poorly because they were girls who weren't from families with status or anything. The initial investigation wasn't particularly well cared for. The autopsies were done by a janitor. No joke. Just some really bafflingly poorly done stuff, but also there were some elements of one of the girls had a secret boyfriend, and the family was trying to hide that because that was bringing shame on everyone. And so at the same time that the investigation was being bungled, the family was also trying to save face but lying to authorities to do that. And so the whole situation was just a mess. And the author is trying to dig through that to find out what may or may not have happened. And unlike a lot of crime writers who are going for the true crime angle, she doesn't try to tell us what happened. She is just trying to provide us with as many opinions and as many facts insofar as the facts are available. And I thought that was incredibly successful. I read this within 24 hours. I thought it was really compelling. I think, however, that people who are drawn to true crime writing and go into this thinking it's that style of true crime as opposed to an investigative piece are going to be disappointed because it doesn't tell you what to think. You are invited to hear these are the facts and go from there. So I thought this was fantastically well done and fantastically even-handed too, because there are so many elements to that are frustrating in terms of not just the investigations and the family, but in terms of the whole social structure of these people in rural areas and the structures that are keeping them down both on a wider social level and on a community level and all of that. And the author is not trying to provide any easy answers to any of that. She's just showing you what's happening. And I thought it was fantastically well done. But as I said, I think true crime fans are not necessarily going to be drawn to the narrative style. And I also think there is a style in which I liked, but I know not everyone does, where the author will, so if a language is conducted in an interview other than English, in Hindi or in the local language, she will have a sentence in the original language, like a kind of he said or the report indicates, and then the English in a sentence later, which I like because then it's a language you can see the original and not wonder about the translation. And also, if you're used to seeing that style, I think it's a normal style. But I know for a lot of readers that is not a style that they're going to be accustomed to, and I think, so I'm not sure that everybody's going to love that. But I thought this was fantastic, so this was a great way to start the prize reading. Super depressing, but really well done. After that, I read Billie Jean King's memoir, All In. This is the longest book that was in my group. It's just under 500 pages. And this was kind of fascinating because I'm not necessarily the biggest tennis fan, but I'm surrounded by a lot of tennis fans, so I know a lot, and I sort of follow it secondhand, I suppose you could say. And this was really interesting because I didn't expect this to be as fascinating as it was. She lived through a lot of really interesting times, both in sport and socially. And she has a really interesting perspective on kind of activism via capitalism, where she would try to get women's events and just be pushing for sponsorships and be very money driven with the goal of if you make this much money, then they can't deny that people are willing to pay to go and see the women play, and how that drove equality in the sport. And all of that is really interesting because it wasn't something I had ever thought of before. Some of that does get uncomfortable because she talks about how Virginia Slims was the sponsor for the women's tour, which is the reason they could even have a women's tour. And her argument is it wouldn't have existed without them, so it was a positive. But you do think, tobacco company sponsorships are not morally uncomplicated. But again, it's interesting to know what the perspective on that was. And I had never given particular thought to how that history happened. And she also has a lot of interesting points about the evolution of attitudes towards, in addition to gender, race, and sexuality, and international politics affecting people's lives. And she talks about people who were defecting during the Cold War. She talks about her wife is South African and was a professional tennis player during the apartheid era. And she talks about other people's activism as well. She talks about, for example, how Arthur Ashe pushed to go to South Africa to play at a time when people in sports weren't going to South Africa anymore. The way she presents it is that he was viewing it as, if you cut them off, they can buy into their own propaganda, whereas if he could be playing tennis at a high level as a black man in apartheid-era South Africa, he was sending a message. And I mean, obviously that's something that a lot of people would debate. Her wife is a white South African former professional tennis player as well, and so she has a lot of commentary about how her wife's family were actually anti-apartheid, but being somebody who was playing internationally, she kind of became a symbol of something to be protested. And all of that is kind of interesting to see behind the scenes, because I think that's something we see a lot of now in terms of whether a boycott of a country should include individuals from said country and where the line is. So there's a lot of discussion about that. Some of the personal stuff is interesting as well. She was with her husband for a long time after she was outed, and she had been out to him for a long time, and he refused to give her a divorce even though he knew she was a lesbian, and that's all really interesting. The writing style, I thought, left a bit to be, I mean, by celebrity memoir standards, it was fine. I had started reading the book, and then the audiobook was available from my library, so I listened to that because she reads it herself, and I think with celebrity memoirs that tends to be the better choice, and I think it was here, because I think her style lends itself more to the voice than the page. The one weird thing that got me, and that made me wonder who the target audience for this was, is that a lot of her terminology and a lot of points feels a little bit outdated, like not necessarily offensive, but just she's talking about, say, race in the 1960s, or a trans woman tennis player who played in the 70s, and the language that she uses around race and around gender in those parts feels very old-fashioned, not very old-fashioned, feels like it's of that era, which made me wonder if this is written for people of her generation. She's almost 80, and I did wonder, is she writing for people who are, say, over 65? Because I feel like that makes more sense. I feel like a lot, the younger people are, the more they will bristle at some of the language, maybe. Which feels like that could have been an editorial choice, because a lot of that is clearly neutrally meant. So that struck me as something that, I mean, there must have been an editorial discussion about that. I can't imagine that there wasn't. So it did make me wonder if it's for the older fans who remember her Battle of the Sexes game and whatnot, or if it's for a younger generation who didn't know any of this. Because this is a book that after I read, I did find myself telling my mother and telling one of my neighbors, did you know, blah, blah, blah. So this was definitely interesting in the sense that it was a lot of stuff that when people talk about tennis and sports and, did people know about X issue in 1973? And you can say, yes, they did. That was in public discussions in the 70s when I read this book and know about it. Or that was a discussion in the 60s. And so, yeah, it was really interesting from that perspective. And yeah, it surprised me because celebrity memoirs normally don't surprise me in that way. So yeah, that was impressive. So both of those I thought were absolutely positive surprises for me, because I was expecting a generic true crime and a generic celebrity memoir, and those were actually both top-notch and really interesting. Unfortunately, on the flip side, there was a book that I thought I was going to enjoy that I ended up being really frustrated with, and that was Amia Srinivasan's The Right to Sex: Feminism in the 21st Century. Now, a lot of that is interesting. The final section in there where she is talking about the quandary of university professors and lecturers who have romantic entanglements, romantic relationships with their students, and the level of consent that's possible when there's a power differential like that. And but at the same time, are you infantilizing people who are adults if you say that they can't consent? And that whole discussion and the complexities around that was really fascinating. So if that final section of the book were the only part of the book, I would say that was great. However, it was not. And I did think one of the things that was successful in that part, that was successful throughout it, and that I appreciated about the book, is that she is presenting a lot of nuanced takes on ideas that I think anyone who's read a lot about modern feminist thought is not going to be, but I think if you haven't, it's educational. And just the way that she balances it out by talking about things being more nuanced than this is clearly right and this is clearly wrong. I appreciated that perspective. However, the reason I'm calling this a disappointment is because there were repeatedly things that she would say that were either not quite right or weren't interrogated in a way that made me wonder why she had chosen the example she had. So, for example, in the first section, she talks about the Delhi gang rape case, where the victim was disemboweled and died after being disemboweled after being gang raped. And one of the comments that she makes is that the only reason people cared about this and that it was in the media is because this person was a university student and they were high class and high caste, which isn't actually true. She was a student, and because of that, it was assumed that she was high class and high caste, but she actually wasn't. And that actually is one of the side things that's talked about in this book. And so I had thought, because I just read this, maybe that's something that's not that well known. So I went and looked around, and no, it's even on Wikipedia that her family was struggling and they were really putting this effort into putting her through university and everything. And so I thought the fact that she simplified it in a way that was wrong, instead of saying that the reason it got the media attention was that people assumed that she was from a high-class family, and just brushed it off as, yes, she was, is an oversimplification, because the rest of the style seems to be implying have some nuance. But then this is oversimplified to be wrong. Then in the section after that, she is talking about the Me Too movement, and is talking about a couple of different cases, ones where clearly people were raped, and then ones where people were probably just sleazy and inappropriate, but they didn't actually rape or assault anyone. And the example she uses of someone who's just sleazy is John Hockenberry. And she makes fun of an article that he wrote after he was fired from NPR. And the part that she keeps poking at is impotence or penis comments. And I thought it was really weird that she chose to poke at that, because I've read Hockenberry's memoir from back in the 90s, and I've read some of the comments that he's made throughout his life, because in general there's a stereotype out in the culture that paraplegic men can't have sex, which is such an oversimplification of things, and something that he has kind of railed against in the pre-Me Too part of his career. So the turnaround in his post-Me Too essay, where he kind of plays into that stereotype, is really interesting and disappointing as someone who has read his stuff and enjoyed it in the past, that he's a sleaze and an unrepentant sleaze. However, because she's kind of poking at that, I felt like she was missing an extra level that should have been discussed if you're going to use him as the example. If you introduce him as the example and don't say, here's the social piece related to disability, it's, again, mispresenting the situation. And I thought, there are so many able-bodied men that she could have used in that same situation. That he's your example of a middle-class white man is weird when the part that she's poking at is the part that's directly related to disability, and she doesn't really talk about disability. And again, like, it doesn't really disprove her point, because this is still a sleazy man who thinks he can get away with it, but the way he explains it is very disability specific. And again, that she doesn't talk about that is misleading, and there are so many other examples she could have used for that. So I found that really frustrating, and because those are the first two sections of the book, I was pre-annoyed before I got to the parts that I thought were good. So this is very good in a lot of ways, but I was massively frustrated by these two things at the beginning, because one of them was simplified to a point that it was wrong, and the other one simplified this whole extra social element that it had. So I don't know, I was frustrated by that, but I think there is a lot of in here that is worthwhile, especially if people haven't read a lot about feminism. So yeah, there you go. And then today I just finished In the Weeds, Around the World and Behind the Scenes with Anthony Bourdain by Tom Vitale. Tom Vitale was the director and was originally an editor on Bourdain's show and then later a director. So they worked together for a number of years. It sounds like Vitale had a drinking problem and a depression problem, and in working through that wrote this book about essentially their working relationship. So having just finished that today, I haven't really let it marinate much, but I do have lots to say since I just finished it, I guess. One of the striking things about this book is that everyone, from the author to Bourdain to everybody else, is pretty unpleasant. These are all not people that you would want to be working with or hanging around with, although they definitely succeeded in a lot of television pieces, so whether that works for the particular style of television they were doing, I guess it did, but wow, unpleasant. That said, I did read this all at once. I read the introduction a couple of weeks ago, but then I sat down and read all of this morning. It was fantastically compelling, despite the fact that everyone was unlikable, and despite the fact that I've never seen the TV show. I've certainly seen bits of it, especially when Bourdain killed himself. It was in the media everywhere, but I've never seen a complete episode. And I think if you have, this would probably be well worth reading just to get the behind the scenes stuff, because there were a lot of parts where I thought if this were an episode of something I had seen, I would find this really interesting, because you would know which bits were staged, were accidental, and which bits should have gone a different way if things had worked out one way or the other, and which bits where people became violently ill after eating things. So I think this will be especially entertaining to people who watch the show, unless they have an illusion that some of these people are nicer than they appeared on TV, because I think that might be a little disappointing. So the two main issues that I have with this are, one, that there are a few chapters in here, especially when he's talking to Bourdain's last girlfriend, that are really uncomfortable and that I felt were not really the authors to share. And I wish they hadn't been included, because I did think this was unprofessional. You should have skipped this. So there were a bit of things like that where I thought, this is somebody where your relationship is based on a common friendship, and I felt like it was morally iffy that some of those stories were being told, because this is not, he's not a journalist reporting on these things. He was somebody who approached people, someone with a friend in common, so that felt iffy to me. Also, he occasionally gets things wrong, and considering that the show was supposed to be about sharing the world and showing people about the world and teaching people about the world, at one point, let me read it. I took a screenshot of this because it was so ridiculous. So he's telling a story about when people had food poisoning, and here's one where he's saying that Bourdain is telling him a story about somebody ordering seafood in Namibia. And he went on to explain, in Namibia, the seafood jambalaya was an extremely poor menu choice, pointing out how far each of the ingredients had traveled to get to this landlocked Central African country. Namibia is, one, not Central African. Its name prior to independence was Southwest Africa. It's in Southern Africa, one. Two, it's not landlocked. It's on the coast. Walvis Bay, where everybody goes snorkeling, is in Namibia. Like, everything in that sentence is wrong. And so when I saw that, I thought, okay, how much of the rest of this is wrong? How many of the restaurants that he's naming and the cities that he's naming, how much of this is wrong? So that frustrated me, because I got to that section where he's talking about when people came down with food poisoning is quite late in the book, but it made me question everything else before that, because reading this, you do go through it and think, oh, it might be fun to visit that place or this place. And I got to that sentence and thought, you may have gotten all of this wrong. You're clearly not trustworthy. Because how you think Namibia is a Central African country that's landlocked? How? This is basic geography. And I know there's a joke that US Americans don't know anything about world geography, but this is a guy whose job for more than a decade was traveling and telling these global stories. So no, he or his editor should have gotten that. To get the location of a country wrong when it used to be called Southwest Africa is mind-boggling to me. That is such nonsense. This was really compelling, but how much value is there if I can't trust the author, right? Like, this is frustrating about that. So I don't know. I'm gonna have to think on that one. There will be a cut here while I... Next up, The Irish Assassins by Julie Kavanagh. Conspiracy, Revenge, and the Phoenix Park Murders that Stunned Victorian England. This is a book that I don't really know how I feel about, because it's technically about interesting stuff. It's about a murder by stabbing with a surgical scalpel of these two Victorian-era British politicians in Ireland during a period when people were talking about home rule, and they would argue, well, these murders put home rule back. And it's like, well, can you punish an entire country for the actions of one or two assassins? And the answer is, of course, yes, that's what colonialism does. This book is not actually centrally about that. It is about a bunch of different politicians and protesters and the wives and mistresses of politicians in both Ireland and in England. And I don't know if this is good or not. I found this incredibly boring and sloppy in the sense, and not necessarily sloppy in the sense that there were errors in it, although to be honest, this isn't something that I know a huge amount about, so I might not have recognized that. But sloppy in the sense that I didn't think it was well structured, and I was kind of baffled by this because Kavanagh is a ballet critic whose last book was a biography of Nureyev, and why she was writing this seems strange to me. Until you get to the final section, and in the final section she mentions that her parents, who were both journalists, both had projects about the series of things that happen in here, and when they died she kind of took over this research project. And the issue that I kind of have with this is that if she had written this in one of those joint memoir research style, I think that would have connected it all a lot better. So I had to reread this after I read the afterword because it made more sense why all these various things are included, because her father's project and her mother's project were not exactly the same projects. And also then it made sense why this ballet critic was writing this book about Victorian era history. It wasn't honestly any more interesting reading it through the second time than it was the first. However, I think it might be for especially people like Irish Americans or Irish Australians whose ancestors immigrated around the time that this is describing, might be interested in the context around that. And I think if you have that personal connection, that makes it more interesting. And especially South Africans, because there's kind of a South African connection, and Kavanagh is originally South African as well. So I think for that market, this probably does what it's more or less supposed to do, but I do wish that she had worked the kind of memoir elements into the history, because the collection of specific facts and events doesn't feel tied together in a way that is even remotely satisfying, I thought. But if she had been explaining it in terms of her father did this research and her mother did this research and she was following that trail, I think that would have been a more compelling book. Now, I mean, all that said, did I learn some things that I didn't know? Yes. Did she write the book that she wanted to write? I think so. So this is reasonably successful, but it's not successful in the sense that if you don't care about it, you could just pick it up and be entertained. I wasn't entertained, but I think it was educational enough, which is kind of interesting because it's basically the opposite experience that I had with In the Weeds, which I enjoyed, but had all kinds of errors in it, and I don't think was successful. So that's kind of funny. And finally, I need to talk about George Saunders' A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, which is a book that was definitely successful, but that I hated. So George Saunders is obviously a famous novelist and short story writer, and he teaches a class that only 6 people a year get to take, but lots of other people would like to take this. And if you've watched any of my other videos where I encounter art student memoirs or art student experiences or anything about art students, I generally hate this stuff. And this book is essentially trying to give the reader the experience of being in part of one of his classes in which he deconstructs and explains some short stories by various Russian writers. The way it's broken up I found really irritating, especially at the beginning where you get 1 page of the story and then 1 page of his commentary. And like, genuinely, this made me want to punch someone. However, I am a person, when I was at university, I had to take 1 humanities course as part of a breadth requirement. And in some ways it was a great course because we read a lot of different pieces of literature for that from various countries and various time periods. And it was great in those terms. But the analysis in the classes always drove me crazy. One of my friends who was in the same class used to joke that there was about a third of the class who were into it and were taking this because this was what they wanted to study, but 2/3 of the class were taking it for the same reason that we both were, which was breadth requirement. And about a third of them, 1/3 of that 2/3 were asleep because they didn't care, and the other third were outraged and saying, this is all nonsense. I was one of the this is all nonsense people. So reading this book, which is George Saunders telling you about these Russian short stories, irritated me because I hate this kind of thing. This is the kind of thing that felt like nonsense to me, but I know that people who would want to take that class would not think that. People who want to take this kind of class will love this, because this is 100% what people, that 1/3 of people who thought, wow, this is so insightful in my long ago humanities class, will 100% enjoy this. So I think it's successful at that. However, and here's the other issue, and Saunders admits to this in the beginning, he doesn't speak Russian. He's reading all of these in translation, and he says in the introduction that we're going to treat the stories as if they were written in English, which is fine, but then you need to talk more about the choices the translator is making. I don't speak Russian, but I know that Russian and most Slavic languages are more grammatically complicated than English is. English is like, you know, Afrikaans and Indonesian, Malaysian, grammatically relatively simple. And whenever you're translating from a language that has more grammatical complexity, like never mind cultural stuff that doesn't translate and things like that, but there are some things that are just not going to come across. So I wondered how much of that would happen. And if you go to Goodreads, and I'll find this review and link it if I can, there is a Russian speaker who talks about one of the stories and basically points out that the big dramatic comment that Saunders is making at the end about this boy's relationship with his mother, or the mother's relationship with the boy, is completely wrong, because in Russian there are gender markers that show that the boy is not talking to the mother in this sentence that Saunders clearly takes as talking to the mother, because in English you just don't have the same markers. And that to me is the biggest problem with this, and the thing that kind of drives me crazy whenever, if you've ever done a buddy read where people are reading different translations of the same book into the same language, or somebody's reading the original and somebody's reading the translation. And it always slightly irritates me when somebody says, wow, this author made this beautiful sentence. And in the original language, it's 2 or 3 sentences, and it's not like that at all. That was not the author. And again, Saunders says at the beginning, he's approaching these stories as if they were written in English, but they weren't written in English. If you're going to tell me that this writer is making this message when that is not at all what he originally wrote, and that was something the translator chose to make ambiguous to try to capture the rhythm of the language as opposed to the meaning of the language. So that irritated me. But again, I see people talk about translated literature all the time that don't acknowledge any of that. So I think the people for whom this is the market will love this. Also, I'm going to say I was additionally irritated because this is the one book I had to pay for, because the queues at my library for both the ebook and the physical book were genuinely endless. I would not have gotten them in time to read them for this. So I had to pay for the ebook, and I resent it. So I can't dock points because I resent the fact that I had to pay for it, but it did make me really grumpy while reading this. But I acknowledge that it is doing what he wanted to do and what the target market will want it. So I cannot make this the worst book that I read. That probably has to be in the weeds, which, as I said, I enjoyed, but stuff was wrong with that, both factually and otherwise. But this was definitely the book that I hated, but it was good. This is the frustration of this. So the way I'm going to rank these books is I'm going to put The Good Girls first, because I both thought that was incredibly compelling, incredibly informative, and I liked it. I mean, obviously it's a harsh topic, so liked, but you know what I mean. It was a good read. It did what it was trying to do. And number 2, I'm going to put in the Billie Jean King memoir, I think, because it was really long, and I genuinely thought I was going to think it was too long, but I thought it was, for a celebrity memoir, which is what it is, it did what it was supposed to do. And even though I had some questions about some of the language use, I kind of suspect that it's aimed at an audience who aren't going to object to that particularly, and anybody who's reading it outside of that is just a bonus. So I feel like it works for its target market. I learned a lot, which I didn't expect. I found it a lot more interesting than I thought it was going to be. So that was genuinely one that I was not looking forward to reading, and I found it really surprisingly decent quality. Is it the best written of any of these books? Definitely not. But again, this is a celebrity memoir, and by the standards of celebrity memoir, I thought it was pretty decent quality, and as I said, surprisingly interesting. Number 3, I'm going to give to The Irish Assassins, because I was bored by it, but I don't think I'm the target market for it, and I didn't see anything that was really wrong with it. It was fine. Not my favorite thing, but it, again, lots of these things don't have to be. This was tough because I had to go back and forth between that and The Right to Sex, but there were so many things wrong with The Right to Sex that I ended up putting that in number 4, because I was thinking about it, and I'm not just bothered by the class thing in the first chapter or the lack of nuance in the second chapter, but there's also a bit where she's talking about the Hanau shootings, and I didn't talk about this before because when I read the book, it was genuinely the 2nd anniversary of that shooting, so I thought, am I being too, emotional about this because I've just watched the ceremony online? And I thought about it more, and I think, no, this wasn't just me emotionally reacting. I think the issue with that is a lot of people outside of German-speaking countries don't know the context around that, and so when she frames it as an incel thing as opposed to a xenophobic/racist thing, I think she's giving this whole Anglophone audience the wrong context, because she's taking what is a small part and making that the only framework that people are going to have for that event, and that I think is really objectionable too. So I have to take 3 points away from it because those 3 things really did bother me. So yeah, I almost put that in 3rd because I've heard so many glowing reviews of that one from booktubers whose opinions I definitely respect, but no. So in 5th, I'm putting A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, because yes, it does what it's supposed to do, but I genuinely hated the reading experience. And it did get that one thing wrong, even though he has the caveat at the beginning that he's going to get stuff like that wrong because he's ignoring the fact that they're translated. But they are translated, so you can't ignore that. I feel like that's a gap that, and honestly, actually, now that I'm talking about it, I think that's a problem in the way Anglophone countries view Russian literature in general, and actually even ancient Greek literature, and sort of slots it into a Western framework that it is not part of. And this is why people don't understand anything that happens in Eastern Europe, because if you insist on sticking something into a Western framework when that is not what it's coming out of, you're never going to understand the actual context. And that's what this book does. Now, I mean, this is not a socio-political book. You're replicating somebody's MFA experience. And it does that, but I hate it. Yeah. And then last had to be In the Weeds, because even though I enjoyed reading it, there was so much wrong with it, both in terms of it feeling kind of like a cheap cash-in to Anthony Bourdain's fame, the whole geography stuff that was wrong, and then the weird talk this out with your therapist, don't tell me about it element. So even though I thought that was a compelling read, that does have to go last. So yeah, there we go. That was section C. So it was interesting. It's hilariously, I'm not going to be judging in round 2 because I took a week off of checking my fun email because I had a deadline that week, so I missed signing up for it. Oops. But yeah, we'll see. I'm looking forward to seeing how everything turns out. Anyway, if you were judging, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you read any of these books, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. Yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.